According to the National Center for Drug Abuse, over 165 million Americans ages 12 and up are currently abusing drugs or alcohol. Of those 165 million Americans, there is a mom, dad, sister, brother, wife, husband, son, daughter, or grandparent praying and pleading that they would stop. Addiction is a subject most people don't like to talk about and is kept behind closed doors. But the Finding Hope podcast will bring light to the subject and give families that are living in shame, guilt, hopelessness, fear, worry, and anger tools and education to find strength, peace, happiness, joy, and hope. Hello, I'm Amy LaRue, Finding Hope Coordinator for Hope is Alive Ministries and your host for this Finding Hope podcast. At Hope is Alive, our mission is to radically change the lives of drug addicts, alcoholics, and those who love them. We do this through our intentional next-level sober living homes and faith-based support groups for the loved ones of addicts called Finding Hope. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I want to share with you about our upcoming Hope After Loss retreat in Tulsa, Oklahoma, October 4th through the 6th. This retreat is for anyone who has lost a loved one to the impact of addiction. At this retreat, you will have a time to process your emotions and press forward on a journey of healing and restoration. We'll link in the show notes today, the link to register. But today I have a dear friend with me, Mr. Shawn Baker. But Shawn, I actually knew your wife before I met you. Mm-hmm. But before we jump into all of that, why don't you share a little bit with our listeners about you?
Again, my name is Shawn Baker. I was a resident of one of the Hope is Alive homes. Most recently, I was employed by Goodwill Industries of Central Oklahoma before I came to HIA. I came to the home in August of 2022. I currently live in Yukon, married to my wife, Leslie, have been for almost 7 years. And so that's kind of the brief, recent background.
Yeah. So 2022, so that was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay. So why don't we just jump right in?
Okay.
You were a resident of our program, Hope is Alive, which is a sober living mentoring program we have here. Right. And so what was the journey getting to that place?
Well, literally began drinking beer and experimenting with that thing when I was 12. That's just kind of what we did. I was in 8th grade and we'd go to parties and we'd have one or two and you'd think you got away with something. It was just kind of what we did. It literally progressed from there through high school, then going to college. That's just kind of, it's what we did. I grew up in Norman and we were going to frat parties when we were sophomores in high school.
That's crazy.
And, they didn't care. They let us in. It was nothing off their backs. And again, this was in the late 70s and early 80s where, rules were a little relaxed, if you will. And then it continued to progress from there. And I really didn't experience too much in terms of pushback. There was never any sort of negative response to the drinking. That's just kind of how we operated, what we did, everything that we did to an extent it was surrounded by, whether it be a ball game, a birthday party, an anniversary, something at work or what have you, that it always included alcohol. And I got married in 1988 and continued to drink. And it finally began to cause an issue because of monetary things. All of a sudden, where did the money go? Well, then that leads to deceit. And it just kept going and going. And then I would get to a point to where I would try to be better because I just knew that something bad was going to happen. Just never enough bad happened for me to stop.
Did you realize you're addicted?
I didn't for years, really, until really about 15 years in. I realized that all of a sudden someone made me think, you do this every day. And really no one else does that. So I never even stopped to answer or ask the question why. But it was too powerful at that point for me to stop. And I would literally plan my days. I had great jobs. I worked for AT&T, worked for a U.S. congressman on Capitol Hill, and that's what we did. I mean, we just literally, my job at AT&T was to get guys in a room to where we'd go to a bar, and that's what we did.
Wine and dine.
Exactly. I got paid to do that. And what I failed to realize was that once I had my two boys, I've got two sons, 28 and 27, and they began to become secondary. And I just failed to either realize it or admit it. My wife at the time finally said, okay, enough's enough. And so I would stop for a while. And then finally she left and took them with me. And even that wasn't enough. I thought, surely I can do this. I've been successful enough to do it. And I just wouldn't stop regardless.
Which is real interesting because, as a wife of an alcoholic, I always would think, why can't he stop for me? If not for me, the kids, right? Like, and that's what you're saying. Like you got to that point where you couldn't either. And so what did you do with that?
Well, I finally had someone tell me that, and they literally put it in a sentence where they said, Scotch is more important than your boys. And I'd never really heard it put to me like that. And as really as negative and as embarrassing as that statement was, and as hurtful as it was, it wasn't enough. And I continued because I knew that I could somehow survive. I was able to survive without it, and I would justify it, and I would do just enough to maintain my relationship with my boys, even after they moved back to the East Coast, where I would continue to do it because I was always able to get away with it. I was always enabled enough by enough people to get away with it, really not realizing fully what it was doing to me physically and mentally. I knew I'd lost job after job after job, but that wasn't enough because I could always get another one. Finally, I'm currently, married to Leslie, have been for almost 7 years again. And she finally walked up to me one day and she had become visibly troubled by it. But I continued to kind of nibble around the edges, if you will. I was able to working for Goodwill, able to survive, great job there. And finally she walked up to me one day and just said, really? That was it. I mean, you might need to find another place to live.
So that's real interesting. So back up, Scotch is more important than the boys.
Yep.
But then you hear this word, really?
Yeah.
What do you think the shift or the change was in that?
There was something in her voice that for some way, it took me 40 years to hear that tone and to hear that reality. Maybe it was the experiences that had began piling up. There's no good ending to this. And I came to realize the one thing that when I talk to other young men, is that I use the analogy roll the tape. Because if you think of your favorite movie, you've seen it a dozen times, you know the ending. And if I had to have the ability to roll the tape, that first drink, how innocent it might be, and the environment, regardless of how inviting that is, we all know how it's going to end. And with the tone in Les's voice that afternoon, I just finally said, you know what, something's got to be better than this, because the deceit became such a burden and the lying became such a chore that we grew up in the church. We had the heritage. I knew what was right and what was wrong. It just didn't matter. But finally, there was something in her voice that just kind of said, come on, you're better than that. And we all deserve better than that. So go make it happen. We had a family friend who knew of Hope is Alive, who they knew a young man who is now a very successful program manager with us in Dallas and Fort Worth. And they said, why don't you give it a try? And August of 22, entered the home and graduated in January of this year, 2024. And in the midst of that, like I said, I was working for Goodwill. I was approached by Ari Patchen and Grant Green. They said, would you consider a career change? And it took me about 5 seconds. And I said, absolutely. As much as I enjoyed and loved being with Goodwill, because we did great things there, it was a very quick decision, very quick turnaround, and clearly the best decision that I've made, because I love what it is that I'm doing, and the idea that I don't have to lie and I don't have to cheat and I don't have to hide, and I can be what God truly designed for me to be.
That's so good. So much, I just keep going back to that word, really. Because we talk about at Finding Hope so many times, like, what is it going to take for our loved ones to get not just sober, but recovery? Like, there's that difference. And we've talked about it a little bit on here. And we think it might be jail. Were you ever arrested?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
3 times.
3 times. We think it might be, I even hear like, well, they lost their friend to an overdose. Or we think it's they're on the streets. But we don't know what their place of desperation is going to be. And for you, it was one simple word. Really.
It was. It wasn't that she shamed me. It wasn't that at all. It was simply a very gentle but firm question that needed to be put exactly that way for me to get it. The scoldings, the shaming, the job losses, nothing was sufficient for me to really get to the point where I was going to respond. But looking in her eyes and to just look at me like a very best friend would do. It really illustrated to me that she was indeed that, and to where that really communicated with me so well, so simply, and really it was simply complicated to where the question was multifaceted, but she boiled it down to one word, and it allowed me to kind of say, that's right, really, and that was the one thing that got me to thinking.
So did you go to treatment ever, like rehab?
I was in a facility about, 15 years ago up in Northwest Arkansas. It was one of those things to where I either did that or did 6 months in county jail after a DUI. I was there, did my 6 months, and they actually had me. I ended up almost running the facility because they knew of my past history in business, and so I ended up kind of being their PR person for another 2.5 years. So I had stints of sobriety. But until, I got here and really, really understood to me what it meant for the first time in my life. And I visited with many others about this. For the first time, I literally shut up and I began to listen. There's a difference between listening and hearing. Listening is participating with other people and giving them value. And I just, for the first time, kind of said, okay, you're not all that. Just listen and be quiet. And that was such a big piece of my recovery, to where I could listen to what other people did, understand that I'm no better than any of them, to be able to understand, identify the source. I mean, why not only did you start, but why couldn't you stop? And to understand that Christ is at the center. Recovery is possible, but it's not complete. And so that's kind of the way I approached it.
Well, and I want to back up a little bit because you go and speak at churches and stuff, but you recently, a couple months ago, we were at your home church, the church you grew up in. And so I think that's important to our listeners out there to realize, like, you grew up in a great church and a family and all of that. So will you kind of share with that? Because sometimes we think it's, okay, what did I do wrong? Like, I had him in church every day, all that. Like, can you share with our listeners a little bit about that? And
sure. Like I said earlier, we were raised to know what was right and what was wrong. We did. The pressure that we had, I guess you could call it peer pressure. I don't know, societal pressure, was enough to make us want to deviate from that. Sometimes you want to get out from under the thumb of your folks, and with certain personalities have that a little more of addictive, addictive slant to them than do some others. I was never more frustrated than when I was around friends that could have one or two and stop. That was frustrating to me. And I was never a lampshade on the head, bumble stumble guy. I mean, I really wasn't. I mean, perhaps more than I'd like to admit or know, but it was one of those things to where when I did something, whether it had been alcohol or something like that, it was full bore all the way, and it was my way or the highway, and really no one knew better, and I could always overcome. That was the fallacy that I operated under. I always could somehow, because I ended up proving to myself, well, yeah, I lost that job, but I can get another one. And I kept proving to myself that even though I was drinking and not doing right, I could always overcome it. But knowing that I had that church heritage and knowing that I had the support and backing of the people in that church, standing up there that morning, telling, hundreds of people that I had known since I could walk what my issue was. They, most of them, the vast majority had no clue. My family had been such, big pieces of that organization and the university that sits right next door. These people were shocked that anyone from our family could have suffered from something like that. And so it was revealing and it was cathartic. It was something that really, it wasn't as if a burden was lifted off my shoulder. It was just very, very, it ministered to me so much to be able to share to others that this is the picture of addiction. It doesn't have any sort of idea. It's not necessarily somebody in a ditch. I mean, I'm no better than anyone else, but look at me. This is the picture. This is what it looks like. And it exists in the church. And it's now my job to be able to communicate to the church that indeed, this is one place where we can address this honestly. So
it doesn't discriminate.
Right. Not at all.
I think that's the big thing is, we were actually talking this weekend, this is in our Sunday school class at a different church. And we were just talking about like how some people, we can see their sins on the outside. It's very easily. And then some, we all struggle with sins within. And this is just, another, it got a strong hold of you. Right. And it's like, we've got to break this stigma, take this mask off. Like you sharing probably freed so many more people to find recovery or to say, yes, my family is struggling too. I had a couple of ladies come up to my table, Finding Hope table at the church after and just sharing with me and just how your story just impacted them and that they could finally feel that, be able to start slowly taking that mask off and saying, my family too. Even though we grew up in the church, we had a great upbringing. Addiction's going to go after anyone and everyone. It doesn't matter your hair color, your economic, or any of that. It's going to go after everyone. That's what it wants. It wants to destroy our families. But, we also know our God is bigger. And look at your family and you after how many years did you say in addiction?
Oh, at least 40, maybe a little more.
40. And I think that's something, I'm glad you brought that up because we see a lot, especially within Hope is Alive. There's a lot of young folks, right? Yeah. I'm sorry if that.
No, that was one of the things I told him, Amy, was that I'm blessed and graced to be here at my age. Just don't wait 30 years to make the right call like I did.
But if you are, it's okay to still do it. And I think that's important. Like when I talk to these loved ones, I love sharing the stories of those that have been in addiction longer because God's not done with you, and we don't know what that when that day is going to be, when that really comes.
Right.
And so I think that's just so important. And I'm just so grateful that you're willing to share that and to share with others what you've gone through for these last 40 years. And so, so we talked a little bit about Leslie and I said, I met her first.
Yes.
And so she started coming to our support groups for family members, Finding Hope. And I didn't even know you. And I'll never forget, it was close to your graduation coming out and I was at their meeting and just like how grateful I could tell she was for the support group. I mean, I'm speaking for her. So, but what have you seen because of her going to Finding Hope?
She understands first and foremost that clearly it's not on her. That's, and you clearly speak this every day, Amy, where the idea that it's not their fault, the family is not their fault. They often, blame themselves for so many things, whether it be, why didn't he or she take my advice, or why is it that I'm not important enough, or why don't I rate with a bottle of bourbon, or there is no logic in explaining to the loved ones. And so they have no answers. And then you add on top of that, they've been stolen from, they've been kicked around, they've been lied to. And she really came to a point where she would come home from those Finding Hope meetings with such a greater sense of understanding that indeed, it was on me to be able to address it first, but it was clearly nothing that she had done that caused it. And so I think that what she would share with what others would mean, the community that we had in the homes at HIA so exists also in those Finding Hope meetings. The community that they have for the first time in maybe their lives, they're surrounded by people with like concerns and like causes. And so the sense of community was one that she really first mentioned. And that two, she would be much more measured in conversations that we would have in comparison to either being very quick to respond or and I don't use this word, Les, I promise, overreacting. I'm not accusing you, but for
and we say that we talk about we're going to respond, not react, but respond.
Right. And so her responses were measured. It was clear that she was gathering things from these meetings because she was thinking often, and she still does, when she responds. And so many of the tools that she's been given at these meetings with living with me and seeing how it is that I progressed have helped her immeasurably.
Well, and I love that. I think it's so important for our family members to go through and remember that you're in your path to recovery, but as family members need to be on the path to recovery. And there's so many different, avenues, but it's like for me, my husband doing that, like it made our marriage stronger and I still had a place I could go and I still got, like someone asked me this last week, like maybe it's just yesterday. Why do you still keep going? And that's the reason, is that community and that support that I get. They're my people. They're my family now, right? Like not just through my husband's ups and downs and my ups and downs, but through life ups and downs. Like the tools we learn is a path that I use in all of life now.
Yeah. And as I explained to her going through the homes, one of the things that ministered to me the most was the ability to sponsor and mentor some other people and to see that light bulb moment. Those were extremely meaningful to me. And she has mentioned to me that there have been times where she has seen those moments in me as well, whether it, small things, doesn't have to be monumental, but small things in terms of the way that I react or the way I respond to certain situations that she can sense where I've changed. And I can see that in her as well. So she doesn't like ever having to miss a meeting. There'll be times we'll be sitting down and talking and all of a sudden I'll look over and she's not there. She's headed out the door and she goes, I'm going to Finding Hope. You can stay there and watch TV if you want. So, but she's thoroughly enjoyed that opportunity in that community.
Yeah. So what advice or tips would you give families that are listening today?
Get involved.
What does that mean?
Don't ignore the problem. Don't think it's going to get better without it being addressed head on. Don't try to get cute. Don't try to get fancy. Ask questions, whether it be your son, your spouse. Ask questions. You might not always get the answer that you're going to get. But the one devastating thing that I think occurs more often than not are family members that don't try to confront it head on. It's painful. And what I've learned, and you have too, there's no recovery without pain. You can't just be a box checker and expect to recover. You've got to ask the tough questions. You've got to become involved. You've got to show the person, whether or not they choose to accept it up front or not, you've got to show that person that you're concerned enough to ask the hard questions and expect an honest answer. But one of the worst things in terms of what not to do is to either ignore the problem or not address it appropriately. Simply look someone in the eye and say, what can I do to help? What is it here that we can do together? And here's what it is that you run the risk of losing. Those types of things. Just be involved, ask the questions. You may not always get the right response as far as you're concerned, but at least you're going to be able to do that and to also avail yourselves of groups, the family members, such as Finding Hope. I mean, ask the questions of those who have been there before, particularly those who are facing this for the first time. You don't have the answers. You don't have the right questions. And so go find a group a Finding Hope group where you can say, hey, what do I do? If you've asked the questions and you don't get the right response, ask someone who has before. Rely and avail yourself of that kind of experience, and you'd be surprised at the answers that you get.
That's so good because we walk on those eggshells.
Yeah.
And we're scared to ask those tough questions because ultimately, I think sometimes deep down we know the answers, but we don't want to hear the answers because then it makes that a reality is true, right?
I met a lady at a Chamber of Commerce function whose daughter, they were scared. She told me, we're scared to admit the reality. We pretty much know it in our hearts, but we're afraid to say it out loud. And what I told her was, it's never going to change unless you say the words that are going to be painful. And that you've got to get to that pain step before you're going to recover.
What we say a lot at Finding Hope is nothing changes if nothing changes. So it's never going to get better. It's going to actually get worse.
Yep.
I mean, until you're like, I don't know what to do. I've waited too long to even address it.
Right.
So.
And in your Hope After Loss groups as well, you finally get back to the point to where it becomes beyond devastating and totally out of your control. So if you don't ask the questions, it can lead to catastrophic results. So it's one thing to have someone in your family that's drinking and to address it and stop that. But there are some things that are so much more serious. And so again, it gets back to my point. Don't ignore the situation. Ask the questions. If you don't, then bad things are typically going to happen and continue to occur.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up, but I want you to think, if Leslie was in here right now, what would you like to say to her?
Thank you for being so patient. Thank you for being difficult. Thank you for being understanding, for being my best friend, because, in life, we often think we have all these friends. And if we really were given the litmus tests and given truth serum, there are so very few that would do anything for us. I mean, anything. And you can typically have them on one hand. And she has exhibited that to me. And so I'm so grateful, Les, that you chose to not run, that you saw something in me that perhaps was, I guess, somewhat appealing, and where you could not only watch me recover, but you could play such a vital role in that recovery and to show other loved ones of those of us that are addicted that, hey, if this guy can do it, then surely we can too.
Well, thank you. Anything else before I end?
I just appreciate the opportunity. We're so grateful, to be here. We love working along with the Finding Hope and Hope After Loss people, you and Darcy, because we think it's a big package. And when we go talk to people about the idea of Hope is Alive, it is such an integral piece of what it is that we all do. And so I'm proud that I get to walk in the door every day and be surrounded by it.
Yeah. Well, we're proud of you too, and all the hard work and that you have done to get to this point.
Thanks, Amy.
I know it's not easy, so we're proud of you and thank you for all that you do and continuing to pour in.
Thank you.
But I do like to leave with a challenge, and you've already challenged our people. So I am going to just kind of try to wrap that up. Okay. Is what's that tough question you're not asking? And so I want to challenge you, if you're out there listening right now, what is that question? What are you avoiding? And maybe you need to journal it today. Maybe you need to just write it out and figure out, why are you avoiding that? And then give it to the Lord and then ask that hard question that you've been holding back, as well as get involved. I think I heard Shawn say that so much about that community. Get involved, get plugged in, and stay plugged in. So thank you again, Shawn, so much for joining us this week. And thank you guys for joining us. And you can learn more about Finding Hope at FindingHope.Today, as well as Hope is Alive in our program that Shawn went through at hopeisalive.net. But we would also love for you to give us a 5-star review, share this on social media, and subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss our next hope-filled episode. Remember, you're not alone. It's not your fault. There is hope.